Alrighty. Hello, everyone. How are we all doing today? I wish you all a marvelous morning. Can you believe it's already December? I love it and I hate it. The first and last two times I've attempted to snowboard, I broke my collarbone and then my wrist back to back. Despite this, I am determined to have a successful run this winter. Skiing is much easier, almost second nature since I grew up water skiing, but this whole boarding thing is a different beast. As I plunged into writing today, I realized I've been using many of the same phrases or transitions throughout the stories, so I took to the internet to try and recollect all that I had forgotten from middle school. I happened to come across UW-Madison's Writing Center with many useful tidbits, but towards the end of the article, there was this conclusion or ending category that immediately triggered a memory for me. Do y'all remember basically every student ever ending their first 10, 15 essays or papers with, "And in conclusion, I will be ending my paper now"? It still surprises me that teachers, well, at least in our school, let us get away with that for so many years. Okie dokie. I think we just get right into it today. We have a bit longer of a story, and it is quite a doozy. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources for today come from listverse.com, Murderpedia, Wikipedia, Crime and Investigation UK, and last but not least, an article by the one and only Skip Hollandsworth of Texas Monthly. I wanted to bring something a bit more mysterious to the table today. Still maybe gruesome or gross, yes, but a bit more of a puzzle. I found myself on Ranker once again, combing through this article about killers who love to taunt law enforcement, consequently leading me to another article about the strangest calling cards left behind by the killers themselves. Many of the same names popped up on both pages, but I was able to snag a few from the ether that I believe are worth sharing. For example, I had wholly forgotten about the creepy notes left by the murderer known as the Freeway Phantom. Everyone always talks about messages left by the Zodiac Killer or BTK, but let's not forget about this guy. He was weird. As explained by Crime and Investigation UK, quote, in Washington, D.C., between April 1971 and September of 1972, a man stalked, sexually assaulted, and strangled 6 young women and girls in the city. He went by the name the Freeway Phantom and remains unapprehended. When police searched the clothing of the killer's 5th victim, 18-year-old Brenda Denise Woodward, they found a misspelled note from the killer addressed to them. It read, quote, "This is tantamount to my insensitivity to people, especially women. I will admit the others when you catch me if you can. Signed, Freeway Phantom," end quote. Samples were analyzed, but no real clues could be gleaned from the note, as it turned out to have only been dictated by the killer. He'd forced Brenda to write it before he repeatedly stabbed her and strangled her to death, end quote. You can look up a photo of his writing. It's very erratic, seemingly random letters are capitalized, and their grammar is all over the place. I was this close to covering the Freeway Phantom today, but I've recently done a few unsolved cases, and I'm not sure I have the patience for another just yet. Instead, we will be covering the Texas Eyeball Killer. On December 13th, 1990, in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, Texas, a resident happened to be walking by the Star Motel when she stumbled across a horrifying scene. A young woman, clearly beaten and deceased, with a bullet wound to her head. The neighbor rushed inside to call authorities, and soon the victim was ID'd as 33-year-old, well-known sex worker Mary Lou Pratt. Police records show she was found with only a t-shirt and bra, both pushed up to her neck. The bullet wound turned out to be from a .44 caliber round, and besides that, not much was found at the scene. Detective John Westphalen was assigned the murder case, and he knew from the get-go that it would not be an easy solve. You see, Mary's body had been killed somewhere else and dumped here. Quote, Westphalen took one look at the Pratt file and realized the case would depend more on good luck than on good detective work. Pratt's killing was a dumped body case, one of the hardest types of murders to solve. She had obviously been killed in one location and dumped in another. There were no witnesses to either the killing or the dumping, no murder weapon, little forensic evidence, no fingerprints, and no apparent motive. Considering the kind of felonious characters who nightly swing by the Star Motel, Mary Pratt could have been shot by just about anyone. End quote. Westphalen, accompanied by his partner Stan McNear, returned to the Dallas County Medical Examiner's office with Mary's body. Both men waited comfortably, expecting a routine autopsy showing the bullet wound as her cause of death. They had sat through countless autopsies before, and not much could shake the two detectives, or the performing technician, Dr. Elizabeth Peacock. That is, until she examined the deceased's face. Elizabeth shrieked as she opened the right eye, and then slowly opened the left eye. She turned to the detectives and said, "My God, they're gone." Both of Mary Pratt's eyeballs had been removed. As described by Skip Hollinsworth of the Texas Monthly, quote, "There were no eyeballs, no tissue, nothing. Mary Pratt's eyes had been cut out and removed so carefully that her upper and lower eyelids were left undisturbed." Peacock was dumbfounded. This was not an operation taught in medical school. The killer had known how to slip a knife around the eyes, making sure not to injure the adjoining skin, and then cut the 6 major muscles holding each eye in the socket, as well as the rope-tough optical nerve. With the eyelids shut, it was impossible to tell that the eyes were missing. Surely, whoever did this had to have had a lot of practice on someone or something. Quickly, Westphalen contacted the FBI's Violent Crimes Apprehension Program unit. Through its computers, the FBI keeps data on the nation's most unusual, depraved mutilations. Bodies chopped up, organs removed, even eyes punctured with a knife as a result of a frenzied attack. But an FBI agent told Westphalen that he found no listing anywhere of such a surgically precise cutting. Longtime Dallas cops take pride in acting utterly unaffected by anything that comes their way, but this time, Westphalen couldn't help it. What kind of person, he asked McNear, would want a girl's eyeballs? End quote. Honestly, all I can say to that is thank God the killer left her eyes closed so the poor old neighbor wasn't even further traumatized that day. The police decided to keep this insane detail under wraps from the public. They didn't want a mass hysteria or the media speculating about cults or devil worshipping or this, that, or the other. It wasn't long before detectives would have their second victim. 2 months later, on Sunday, February 10th, 1991, a 21-year-old sex worker named Susan Peterson was found beaten and bloody and dumped on the same road where Mary's body had been found. Like Mary, Susan was found almost entirely naked, eyes closed, with gunshot wounds to her head, chest, and stomach. Despite her body being found on the same road, it landed in a separate jurisdiction, and Detective Larry Oliver was called to the scene. Still unaware of Mary's murder that had been kept quiet, an eerily similar scene unfolded that day. Detective Larry accompanied the victim's body back to the autopsy room, where a pathologist began their examination, and as he reached the eyes, he motioned for the detective, and as Larry approached the table, his jaw dropped. Both of her eyes had been expertly removed, cut with extreme and precise skill. The pathologist mentioned to Oliver that the Dallas apartment had a similar case only 2 months ago, and within 24 hours, he had set up a meeting with Detective John Westphalen. I love that the autopsy technicians are just like pretty much gossiping to each other behind the scenes while everything is supposed to be kept hush-hush. It's a beautiful thing. These two forces are both working technically different cases, but sharing information is critical since the two are clearly linked. For the next month, Westphalen works tirelessly. Oof. He scores over pages of notes, re-examines the crime scenes, sends undercover units to patrol around Star Motel, and it all adds up to nothing. The killer seemed to remain a step ahead. Police eventually and reluctantly asked the public for help, releasing information about the murdered sex workers, but still keeping the eyeball piece quiet. They knew this may spook the killer, but what did the authorities have to lose? And then, in March of 1991, a third victim was reported. Quote, suddenly, in the early morning hours of March 19th, the killer changed tactics. On Fort Worth Boulevard, another hangout a few miles from the Star, a black sex worker named Shirley Williams emerged from the Avalon Motel where she worked as a maid and turned tricks at night. According to another woman who saw her, Shirley was wearing jeans and a yellow raincoat and appeared to be in a stuporous drug high as she tottered alone on the sidewalk. She was found at 6:20 that morning, dumped on a residential street half a block from an elementary school in the heart of Oak Cliff. As children walked to school, they could see the naked woman crumpled against the curb. An unopened condom was beside her body. Go look at her eyes and tell me if they're there, Westphalen said to the medical examiner's field agent at the scene. The field agent flipped open the eyelids. Gone, he said. Westphalen turned to his partner, Stan McNear. We've got number 3, he said. The autopsy on Shirley Williams' body would show that the surgery had been hurried. The broken tip of an X-Acto blade was found embedded in the skin near her right eye. But there were still no witnesses, no murder weapon, no fingerprints. Worse, the killer had now murdered a black woman, and he had moved locations. Just as the detectives had feared, the publicity, fucking stupid ass word. The publicity around the case had sent the killer away from the Star Motel and his South Dallas dumping ground. There was no telling where he would hit again. End quote. Okay, I must warn you, the case here gets a wee bit convoluted, slightly confusing at this point, but bear with me. I promise it'll make sense. After news of victim number 3 spread around the community, sex workers fled like crazy. They wanted no part of this area anymore. 2 officers by the names of John Matthews and Regina Smith were cruising around the Star Motel area in late March when they came across a veteran by the name of Brenda White. She told the 2 about an altercation she had just nights before involving a man who threatened to kill her and, quote, all the whores, before she maced him and ran from the car. The story reminded the cops of another story they had heard a few months back. Another sex worker named Veronica Rodriguez had told Regina and Matthews about a time a man raped her and tried to kill her, so she ran into the house of another man who saved her. The following day, they ran into Rodriguez again, this time accompanied by a man driving a semi-truck. Officer Smith asked the man for his license, and he complied. His name was Axton Schindler of 1035 El Dorado, and his record was clean other than a few unpaid traffic tickets. Rodriguez claimed that this man, Axton, had been the person to save her from the killer the night prior. However, Axton claimed this to be false. He said he had known her for years, but didn't protect her from any killer. He'd only offered her a ride that afternoon. The officers brought Axton in on the unpaid tickets, but beyond that, they'd forgotten about this incident up until now. Regina and Matthews couldn't shake the story Brenda told them for the rest of the day. Quote, the next morning, as they checked in for work at their police substation, Smith said, we need to run a computer check on that Axton Schindler. And because county government computers contain more information about citizens than city computers, she and Matthews drove to the Dallas County Constable's office near Jefferson Boulevard. There, a deputy constable on duty, Walter Cook, agreed to help them. Seated around the terminal, the officers asked Cook to type in Schindler's address, 1035 El Dorado. The name Fred Albright popped up as the owner of the property. Fred Albright? Where was Axton Schindler? Cook punched in another code. It turned out that this Fred Albright also owned a property on a street called Cotton Valley. Wasn't Cotton Valley in the very neighborhood in South Dallas where the first 2 sex workers were found? Cook kept typing. Fred Albright, the computer reported, was dead. Matthews and Smith stared at the screen. The only clue in this case led them to a dead man. Then, after a pause, Cook said softly, "Maybe this has something to do with a man named Charles Albright." Several weeks before, Cook explained he had come into this office early one morning and had answered a call from a woman who would not identify herself. The woman had been friends with Mary Lou Pratt, she said, and through Pratt had met a man whom she briefly dated. He was a very nice man, she said, but he had an odd love for eyes. She also happened to mention that he kept X-Acto blades in his attic. Cook asked for the man's name. Charles Albright, she said. If any other constable's deputy had been helping Matthews and Smith that day, the link to Albright might never have been made. But good fortune prevailed. Cook typed in another code, and personal information for Charles Albright popped up on the screen. Quote, born August 10th, 1933. Address, 1035 El Dorado. End quote. Holy shit, is what I imagine the two officers said as their eyes widened and their jaws hit the floor. Just in case you missed it, Deputy Constable Walter Cook is the soft-spoken hero of our story today. The officers didn't know it yet, but somehow Charles Albright, Axton Schindler, and the three murdered women were all connected. They rushed back to their department and pulled Charles Albright's criminal record. It showed a history of theft, burglary, forgeries, and assault of a child under 17. His mugshot was that of a handsome man, well-built, with gray hair and deep-set eyes, just as Brenda White had described to them the day before. Regina Smith's face of determination slowly transformed into a grin as she turned and said, "I think we've got the killer." The two officers knew that they had to take this information to the detective in charge, Mr. John Westphalen. They prepped a short presentation and nervously asked to see the detective. Quote, Westphalen greeted them politely. Matthews started, then Smith interrupted, and soon they were both talking at once. John sighed. "Calm down," he said. "Let's take it slow." A few minutes later, after they had finished their presentation, Westphalen decided that they were on to something. He put together a photo lineup of 6 mugshots and told Matthews and Smith to show it to Brenda White. Immediately, Smith and Matthews tracked White down on her usual street corner and asked her if she recognized any of the men in the mugshots. White unhesitatingly pointed to Albright's picture and said he was the man who had attacked her. A little while later, they showed the same lineup to Veronica Rodriguez. According to Matthews, when Veronica got to the third picture, Albright's, she started trembling. Suddenly fearful, she refused to identify anyone. Matthews called Westphalen with the bad news. Rodriguez is so afraid of the killer, he said, that she won't pick out his photo. "Bring her down here to see me," Westphalen growled. End quote. The lead detective knew he needed Rodriguez to crack in order to make any definitive headway. Matthews and Smith brought Veronica in, and the hardened detective changed his approach when he saw the woman in a flurry of tears. Westphalen explained what happened to the other woman she knew. He told her that he needed her help, and she was the key to putting this man away. After what seemed like an endless silence, Veronica grabbed Albright's photo, turned it over, and signed it. At 2:30 a.m. on March 22nd, a tactical team entered the house of Charles Albright and his wife Dixie. Charles was led away silently in handcuffs, while his wife, wholly unaware of his crimes, started to cry. According to Murderpedia, Mr. Charles Albright is a bit of an enigma. Quote, Charles was adopted by Dell and Fred Albright from an orphan's home. His mother, a schoolteacher, was very strict and overprotective of Charles. She accelerated his education, helping him skip 2 grades. His criminal career started early. At age 13, he was already a petty thief and was arrested for aggravated assault. At 15, he graduated from high school and forged his way into North Texas University. At 16, the police caught him with some petty cash from a cash register, 2 handguns, and a rifle. He spent a year in jail. After his release, he attended Arkansas State, and majored in pre-med studies. Found with stolen items, he was then expelled from the college before graduation, but not prosecuted. Unfazed, he simply falsified his degrees, stealing the right documents, forging signatures, and giving himself fictitious bachelor's and master's degrees. He married his college girlfriend, and they had a daughter together. She was a teacher, but he failed to hold a job for long. He continued to cheat by forging checks, claiming false credentials, and he was caught in his deception while teaching at a high school. But he always managed to get probation for his illegal acts, and in 1965, he and his wife separated, finally divorcing in 1974. So this guy is extremely smart, but he just loves doing illegal shit. Albright was caught stealing hundreds of dollars worth of merchandise from a hardware store and received a 2-year prison sentence. Yet he served less than 6 months before he was out again. In 1981, after his mother died, while Albright was visiting some friends, he sexually molested their 9-year-old daughter. They reported him and he was prosecuted. He pled guilty and received only probation. How? He later claimed that he was innocent, but had pled guilty to avoid a hassle. Okay. 4 years later, in 1985, Albright met a woman named Dixie in Arkansas. He invited her to come live with him, and it wasn't long before she was paying his bills and supporting him. Charles took a paper route in the early morning hours, apparently to visit sex workers without raising his wife's suspicions. End quote. A life of lying, cheating, stealing, groping, and getting away with all of it. He literally could have just not stolen and been a successful professor, inventor, lawyer, whatever the fuck he wanted. But what that passage didn't mention was his love of taxidermy from a young age. According to Skip Hollandsworth, Charles spent hours on his taxidermy courses, stuffing and mounting his birds, making them look as lifelike as possible. Then he would be ready for the crowning touch, the eyes. He used to go to a taxidermy shop and stare at the boxes and boxes full of gloriously fake eyes, owl eyes, eagle eyes, deer eyes. He loved their incandescent gleam. He wished he could collect them all, the way other boys collected marbles. His birds had no eyes. Instead, sewnly tight against their delicate feathered faces were 2 dark buttons, each shimmering dully in the living room light. I honestly can't find a better description for a serial killer than a taxidermist with a mom complex. It's almost beautiful. Albright would never confess to any of the murders or to even knowing any of the victims. But during the trial, hair evidence found in Charles' possession was brought in that matched all 3 victims' hairs. The rest of the prosecution's case was a bit circumstantial, but the hairs, along with eyewitness testimonies placing Charles in the company of the victims, along with the box of X-Acto knives found in his friggin' attic, was enough for the jury. On December 19th, 1991, the jury found Albright guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. The last 30 years or so have produced many debates on not so much his guilt, but rather if there was enough evidence to convict him properly. There is no doubt in my mind he's the perpetrator, the killer. The way he acts, his smugness, and even something in his own eyes just shouts murderer. But there are a few people out there who still believe in his innocence. Either way, Charles Albright died in prison just over 3 years ago in West Texas. And that, my friends, is the demented story of the Texas eyeball killer. Golly, I just get so excited whenever I can cover a case that was previously covered by the immaculate Skip Hollandsworth of Texas Monthly. That man, I tell you, does no wrong. I hope you enjoyed the episode today. And as always, thank you from the bottom of my heart for tuning in. I appreciate each and every one of your eardrums. Next week, most likely, heading over to Europe again. I miss it. We gotta go back. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you.